Hey friends, it's Sam from DIY Huntress and I'm so excited about today's project. So before we get started, let's talk about the elephant in the room. I know that resin river tables have been done time and time again and that people are totally sick of seeing them. But I've wanted one in my house for the longest time and I've been too intimidated to make them because I don't have industrial sized tools in my workshop. So today I'm going to show you how I made this DIY resin river table using handheld power tools that were purchased at my local home improvement store. I'm really stoked about this one, so let's get started. This project is sponsored by my friends at Burns-O-Matic. Building a resin river table has been on my personal maker's bucket list for the longest time, so when I got my hands on these two absolutely stunning walnut slabs from my buddy Jeff Mack up in Canada, I knew that I wanted to use them for this project. I'm not gonna lie though, I was a little intimidated because I don't have an industrial size shop and all of the tutorials that I saw for building a table like this included industrial size tools. But let's be real, that hasn't stopped me before in the past from building really cool things, and I was determined to make it happen. So I immediately jumped in and got to work by planning out what handheld power tools I could use for this project that I had purchased at my local home improvement store over the past couple of years. And after narrowing down my tool selection to just a handful of tools, I then got started on the project by first measuring where I wanted to make my initial cuts because I wanted a really beautiful clean edge on one end of the slab and a river in the middle. Now I knew that at the end of this build, I wanted my table to be about 19 or 20 inches wide, including that resin river down the center. So to get started here, I made measurements on both of the live edge slabs and then decided which of the live edges were the more boring ones and cut those using a straight edge with some clamps as well as my circular saw. Now, depending on where you get your live edge slabs, one side may already have a straight edge and you will have to maybe just skip this step, but for me, I was really lucky that I had two live edges to choose from on both of the slabs that I used, and like I said, I just cut off the one that I didn't love the most. But ultimately, once I was happy with my two slabs, I then brought them back to the shop and it was time to prep the melamine boards for the resin pour. I've done a couple of these melamine molds before for other resin projects, and you can find all of those in my resin project playlist on my channel, but ultimately every single time I make one of these, I feel like I learned something new and improved. This time, I knew that this was going to be a big pour, so I started by laying out my pieces in the melamine first, double and triple checked the measurements, marked where I wanted to make my cuts with a pencil, and then made these cuts using the same circular saw that I used to cut the slabs. Now, because the melamine boards that I was using are kind of big, I just propped them up on some of the scrap wood pieces that I cut off of the slabs to get them off of the ground, and once they were there, I used a straight edge and the clamps the same exact way that I used for the slabs, and then trimmed that first board, which is the base of my melamine mold, using my circular saw. Okay, little disclaimer, melamine is pretty gnarly to cut and I'd usually be using my dust collector at this point, but I could not find the dust chute for my circular saw, so I wore a respirator here and also kept my shop vac very close to clean up my mess after I cut. In a normal situation, I probably would have used my table saw to cut these melamine boards, but like I said earlier, I really wanted to challenge myself just to use handheld power tools for this project, and using the circular saw and the straight edge worked out beautifully, really. And just like I used that circular saw method to cut the bottom of the melamine mold, I also used it to cut the side strips as well. Now, one thing I did have to keep into consideration here was that I had to cut these strips at about 3/4 inches taller than they normally would be because I wanted some space at the top of the mold just in case the resin had a little bit of overpour. You'll be able to see this a lot better after I assemble the mold and then add the live edge pieces to it later, but it's just something to keep in mind in case you are thinking of doing a project like this in your own shop. Now, after all of my melamine pieces were cut, it was time to then cover them all using Tyvek tape, and this actually prevents the resin from sticking to the melamine. I have used this method time and time again and it's never failed me, but the one thing that I have found is it's really important to fill every single gap with the tape because the resin will try to find its way to stick to the melamine if it can. But once I was done taping all of the areas of my melamine mold that would be touching resin, it was then time to assemble the mold. Melamine can be really finicky and really brittle, so I decided to pre-drill all of my holes using a countersink bit, and then I attached the boards together using some drywall screws. Because the melamine is so finicky, there were a couple of areas that I was worried would leak resin, so I just taped the bottom of the melamine mold to be safe. I then ran a dry fit to make sure that my slabs would fit beautifully inside of the mold, and once I was happy with the fit, I then took them out and began to seal up all of the little cracks and nooks using some silicone caulking. While I let the silicone caulking in the mold dry, I took some time to prep my slabs for the pour by sanding away any excess bark or grit that was left over. I then flipped the slab over and started to prep the bottom as well. Something I want to mention here is it's really helpful to start with slabs that have already been pre-flattened, but sometimes the pre-flattened slabs do have some low spots like mine did. In an ideal world, I probably would have tried to flatten this slab a little more, but again, I was trying to not use as many power tools as possible here, so to try to get around the situation, I just used some silicone caulking caulking and made a nice thick bead around these low spots as well as any cracks. I then installed the slabs with the wet silicone into the mold, and essentially the idea here is that by letting this dry against the mold, it's going to form a little bit of a dam or a wall that will prevent the resin from seeping underneath the slab later. And honestly, this actually worked out really well. I ended up having a leak underneath the slabs during the pour, but it wasn't even because of this part of the prep work. It was because of some other stupid mistake that I made, but I'll show you guys that a little later. But once the slabs were in place, I then also used some silicone caulking to caulk up any of the small gaps in between the slab and the mold. And I think that this is where I didn't prep well enough because I ended up getting a leak here later. So if you're doing a project like this, please make sure to prep this very carefully. I then just wanted to be safe and clamped everything down using some clamps covered in tape so that the resin does not stick to the clamps. Trust me, I learned this the hard way too many times. And once everything was clamped down, I then used my dust vac to just clean out any of the floating particles to prep for the resin pour. Now, before starting my big pour, there were a couple things that I had to do. One, I had to make sure that the resin mold was set up in a temperature consistent space at about 70 degrees. The second thing I had to do was mix up some tabletop resin and apply it to the bark of the slabs in order to avoid any bubbles from forming during the main pour. Now, I tinted this epoxy to be the same color as what my deep pour will be. Probably overkill, but I just didn't want to risk having any inconsistencies in color. And once I was done with my seal coat, I used my Bernzomatic detail torch to just run it over the wet resin to remove any air bubbles. And if you can't tell by the caked on layers of dried epoxy on this detail torch, this is my go-to torch for so many of my resin projects. It is awesome. And after giving the seal coat some time to cure, it was then time to prep for the deep pour, and the first thing I had to do was make sure that my mold was completely level, and I did this by using a level and some shims. I then calculated how much resin I needed for my pour by stealing a trick from my friend Brad at Fix This Build That, where I took the average width of the river and multiplied it by the height of the river and the length of the river. I then followed the mixing instructions on my particular deep pour epoxy resin for this project, placed it into a bucket, mixed it up super thoroughly by hand, added whatever pigments I wanted, probably went a little overkill, and then transferred that to a clean bucket before pouring. I'm really nervous, but here goes nothing. There were two reasons why I was really nervous about this pour. The first being that I really did not want the resin to leak underneath the slabs. And the second being I've never poured a deep pour project that is this large, and I was afraid that it would not cure on time or the right way. To be honest, I probably was a little bit aggressive with this pour. I realized after pouring into this void that the resin recommended only pouring up to about an inch, and I ended up pouring about 1.25 inches thick, and because of this, it did end up shrinking a little bit when it cured. But ultimately, once I was done pouring the resin to the top of the slab, it was time to get rid of any bubbles, and I did this by using my Bernzomatic heat shrink torch. It's really good for large surfaces, and I wanted to get rid of as many bubbles as possible, and it totally did the job. Now, if you only have a Bernzomatic detail torch, you could use that here as well. It may take a little longer, but that also does work. I actually kept that around for the smaller pour that I did in the big crack at the end of the board. And once all of the major bubbles were gone, I spent some time switching back and forth between obsessing over picking out little dust particles in the resin and then using the torch yet again to get rid of any forming bubbles. After letting the resin cure for 24 hours, I came back and realized that there was some shrinkage in the resin, and so in order to fill this gap, I sanded away some of the excess top coat of the resin, wiped it all away with a vacuum and a cloth, and then filled it using tabletop resin and black pigment. I then used my Bernzomatic torch to get rid of the bubbles the same way as I did in the deep pour. Now, it was during this process that I had the horrible realization that there was definitely a leak underneath the slab. Luckily, no resin leaked out of the mold itself, but I did notice that I didn't do a well enough job of sealing the side of the slab with the crack, and so the resin escaped from the crack and leaked underneath the slab, so I had to refill that crack all the way to the top the same exact way that I did in the center. Luckily though, the second pour went really well, and about a day later I was able to remove the clamps from the mold and bring the mold back into my workshop so I could take the slabs out. And luckily, because I did a really good job of sealing the inside of the mold, everything was really easy to disassemble. I used my screw gun to take all of the screws out and then used a box cutter just to cut away any of the excess tape, but this could be done with the scissor as well. And once the sides were removed, I used the chisel and some girl power to just lift the table away from the mold, and it came off beautifully. After that, it was then time to flip the tabletop over and see the damage that had been caused by the resin leak under the slab. Oh man, it's not gonna be fun. So much resin. If you couldn't tell by my complete and utter disappointment in that last clip, I was really bummed that there was so much resin that leaked underneath that one half of the slab, but I didn't let it stop me. I took the slab off of my workbench, brought it back down to the floor, and started to trim the slab to its final size before having to deal with the mess of resin that I had to clean up. And just like I did at the beginning of the build, I did the trimming using a circular saw and a straight edge. If there's one thing I probably would have changed here, I probably would have just used painter's tape to prevent any chipping of the resin. Luckily, there was none for me, but just a quick little tip. And once I had all 4 sides trimmed to my final dimensions, it was time to flip the slab over and deal with the resin mess. Because I so desperately wanted this to be a 3-tool project, I first tried to get rid of the resin using my orbital sander and 80 grit sandpaper, and when that wasn't working, I then switched over to my belt sander using 80 grit sandpaper. And the belt sander worked really well, to be honest, but just felt like it was taking forever because it was such a thick layer of resin, so I finally kind of admitted defeat and introduced a new tool into the equation. Ignore the mask lines for a second, I'm sure it's a look. Okay. Oh yeah. So I really so badly wanted this project to be a 3-tool project. Get it done using a circular saw, a drill, and a sander, or a belt sander, regular sander, whatever, just a sander. Here's the thing. A belt sander really does work for removing resin off of a project of this scope. However, you have to have the right grit and you have to have the time and the patience. Right now, I don't have any of those. I made a vital error when I poured this project and I didn't prep it the way that I probably should have, and if I did, I probably wouldn't have run into this issue with all of this overpour on the bottom. That being said, I'm really bummed that I couldn't do this just using 3 tools. However, this is my solution. This is a handheld power cleaner. I don't remember how much I paid for it. I think it was under $100, and it's paid for itself about like 1,000 times over. I used this tool on my dining room table build, and it was really awesome. I don't have industrial planers or industrial drum sanders in my shop, or jointers, or any of that fancy stuff, so I'm gonna go ahead and use this hand planer to remove the mistake of the resin that I made on the bottom of this table. Super bummed that I couldn't complete this project using only 3 power tools and I have to incorporate a 4th power tool, but I hope you guys still love me. Sorry. Let's get this project done. After taking time to put my pride aside, I got started using the powered hand planer, and it did such an amazing job of removing the bulk of the resin. And once I got to a point that I was happy with, I then incorporated the use of my belt sander and my regular sander yet again to sand the entire bottom of the tabletop to 220 grit. And once I was happy with how flat and how smooth the bottom of the table was, I then flipped it over to start the same exact process on the top of the table. The major difference between the top and the bottom of the table was that I actually ended up sanding the top of the table to 400 grit. And by sanding to 400, I was able to get all of the swirl marks out of the resin and also give it a really smooth finish to prep it for its final finishing. A couple of other things that I did during this process that made my life really easy were I did not skip any grits when I was sanding to avoid any swirl marks. I kept a microfiber cloth around to remove any excess dust while working with the slabs, and I also made sure to sand a tiny bevel on all of the edges of the table to just get rid of that really sharp corner. I also made sure to keep some CA glue and some black pigment around to fill any voids or holes in the resin and the wood as I sanded. Ultimately, once I was happy with the finish after a couple of hours of sanding, I came back with a wet paper towel and just wet the slab to raise the grain and then gave it a final sanding to its final 400 grit. I then wiped it down and used a furniture finish to seal in the bottom and the top of the slab, but as always, you can find the details on this product as well as all the other products I used in this project on my website by clicking on the link below this video. I originally wanted to weld up my own bases for this table but could not find the time, so I just ordered pre-made bases online that came with hardware already, and I installed them into the table by making small marks with my drill and then pre-drilling some holes and installing them using screws. The one thing I didn't like about these bases was it didn't give me room to use threaded inserts instead of screws, so I'll probably go back at some point and fix this later. But what I did like about this base, other than the style, was that it also came with self-leveling feet, which will make installing this table super easy no matter where I put it. I legitimately cannot believe that I built this table. Like, even watching this video and doing the voiceover for you guys right now is just blowing my mind. I have wanted a river table for the longest time, and the fact that I was able to make one in my little shop with the tools that I had on hand is just amazing. No matter how you feel about river tables, whether you hate them, whether you love them, I just hope that this video shows you that you are able to make cool stuff in your workshop without industrial sized tools or machinery. I really don't know what else to say other than I legit hope that you guys love this project as much as I do. I'm honestly so obsessed with it, and I had so much fun learning throughout this process how to make use of my basic power tools. If you like this project, please make sure to subscribe for more projects in the future. But until next time, friends, thank you so much for your support and for watching, and happy DIYing.